Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with the top 5 decks in the Pioneer format. We're going to be doing a little bit different than we normally do. We're going to be taking a look at some of the newer additions to the decks or some of the newer transformations of the decks over the last several months. As, you know, top 5 has shifted up a little bit. No more Spirits, no more Rakdos Sack. Both those decks have kind of slid down the card a little bit to make room for other things that we'll be talking about. But Mono Green, Rakdos Mid, those are still decks very much showing up in the top of the format. Speaking of which, number 1, Mono Green. Now, this deck really hasn't gained much in terms of new cards. There really hasn't been any broken artifacts printed really since the Stone Brain. But still, you know, it's a deck that does utilize Karn the Great Creator quite well. Usually has a silver bullet for just about every matchup. And its normal game plan is quite powerful and quite quick if you're not disrupting it. The one thing that does change is the flex slot in the main deck. Those of you who don't know what this deck does, it's a hard ramp deck. Elvish Mystic, Land of War Elves, Wolf Willow Haven, and Kiora. And then you have Belukronos Reborn and Old Growth Troll as your other 3-drops. Do this to set up your early Devotion, early Mana Acceleration, and then start casting your bombs. Cavalier of Thorns, looking for Nykthos, and then you start casting your Karns, going and fetching your cards out of your sideboard, and then Storm the Festival primarily to find Karn and Nykthos. The flex slots, there's only really a couple over the main deck. It has changed over the years, or the months, I should say. You know, it used to be things like Love Struck Beast, then sometimes you'd see things like Sky Sovereign. More recently, you see things like Cityscape Leveler being that final flex slot. That's just kind of another powerful over-the-top thing that you can mill into with your Cavalier of Thorns. Beyond that, you do see some experimentation with some builds. This version using a 1-of Tribute to the World Tree. Every creature enters the battlefield. Draw a card if its power is 3 or greater, and otherwise put 2+1/+1 counters on it. Effectively, this is somewhat like a split card of Kiora and the Great Henge. With being a little bit cheaper, plus it's nice on the Devotion. On Arena, I have seen some of the Mono Green variants. Now, obviously, they don't have access to things like Oath of Nissa, so you're trying to make up that slot on there, using something like Up the Beanstalk, which triggers off of your Cavaliers, Storms, and some of the stuff you fetch with your Karn, as well as Cityscape Levelers. So there is some, you know, Invasion of Ixalan is another card you'll see in some of those slots. Basically, it's look for cards, accrue more card advantage, you know, kind of fill in the gaps of a little bit of the error sometimes the deck has. Then you have all the sideboard bullets that we could go over, but, you know, graveyard hate pieces, lock pieces, answer to threats, you know, those kind of things are usually what you see out of the sideboard. Usually there's one copy of artifact or an artifact land, whether it's Darksteel Citadel or Treasure Vault, and then you'll see Pestilent Cauldron and Stone Brain as really your ways to kind of go infinite with the deck, milling your opponent out or just stripping them of all their relevant resources. That's Mono Green in a nutshell. Nothing too exciting for it. You could look at our Mono Green guides if you want a little bit more in-depth about what the deck does and some of the bullets the deck plays. We'll take a look at one more variant of the deck. This version we were talking about runs a 1-of Invasion of Ixalan. This is basically a super powered version of Oath of Nissa. Look at the top 5, you take a permanent card from it, basically your entire deck's permanents. And then a 1-of Wrenn and Realmbreaker. Not really sure what you want this one for. Its emblem can be kind of game breaking, but, you know, I guess it's just an additional 3-drop that allows you to ramp a little bit. It's kind of like Kiora allows you to potentially untap a land, but still, actually it doesn't even untap the land, it just gives it 3/3 and vigilance, so you can attack with a land potentially pressuring other planeswalkers in the early turns. It's another valuable turn 3 play, but I don't know that this is the home for it overall. And then, once again, a little bit of different bullets you see out of the sideboard, but you know, that's one of the things when you play a deck with basically 15 1-ofs in the sideboard, you can see a lot of variation over time. But once again, if you want a little bit better breakdown of what Mono Green does, or some of the specifics like how to mulligan, or how to, you know, key sideboard cards, etc., don't forget to check out our playlist on Mono Green Devotion. Alright, Rakdos Midrange arguably has been the number 2 deck in the format, or number 1 in the deck in the format at large points. This is basically just Rakdos good stuff without the sacrifice component that Rakdos Sack has. So no Mayhem Devils, no Cauldron Familiar, Witch's Oven, just straight good Rakdos Midrange goodness. You know, everything from Thoughtseize to Sheoldred and then things in between. Basically, the big thing with the deck is what 3-drops do I play? How many 2-drops am I playing in terms of, besides 4 Blood Tithe Harvester, how many Misery's Shadows am I playing? How many Reckoner Bank Busters am I playing? Am I playing a Crocs or 2? And then what split of removal spells? But the core of the deck, Thoughtseize, Blood Tithe Harvester, Fable, Graveyard Trespasser, Bone Crusher Giant, and Shieldred, kind of been the keys to the deck's success, and then it's just a matter of how you're shaping your deck around the meta. This version is opting to choose Duress, another copy of Misery's Shadow, split on Go for the Throw Power Word Kill, one of Dreadbore as well, and then for its 3 mana slots, it's playing 2 Graveyard Trespasser, 1 Liliana, 4 Bone Crusher Giant, 4 Fable. It's really a matter of managing your resources as best you can. Sideboard is usually a myriad of answers to fix the matchups, whether it be Running Volley and cards like Noxious Grasp, whether it be cards like Duress and Go Blank for kind of the grindier combo matchups, whether it's things like Kolaghan's Command and Sky Sovereign for kind of the grindier, go over the top matchups. This deck has a plethora of options available to it, but a lot of the core remains the same that it has been for months and months. This version, a little bit different. No Liliana, chooses to run a couple copies of Arcfiend and the Dross, as a little bit more hitting power at the 4 slot. Another interesting one is copies of the End. Now this is basically a 4 mana exile a creature, exile all copies of that creature that aren't on the battlefield. So basically, if your opponent has a Cavalier of Thorns in play, you can pay 4 mana, exile their Cavalier, exile all the rest of their Cavaliers. Similarly, you could do things like your opponent's Shieldred and stuff. Very powerful effect, but very, very costly and for a removal spell. But, could be worth it as a one-of. The sideboard of this version plays another one, and then you have your Duresses to disrupt your opponent. You'll often see multiple copies of Sweepers in the sideboard. These help with the creature-based matchups in addition to all your spot removal, whether that be decks like Humans or Spirits, or Boros Heroic, another deck we'll be talking about in the top of this list. And then you have some type of grindy cards and some type of graveyard hate, as well as customizing your removal for the matchup. One of the more interesting ones, this is kind of a deck in between the mono black mid-range lists that are playing Waste Not and Rakdos Mid. This deck only playing 4 copies of Blood Tithe Harvester, 2 copies of Croxa, 2 copies of Shieldred. The rest of the deck is almost this kind of weird hybrid control deck, kind of tied together by the card Beseech the Queen. Now, Beseech the Queen is a card that requires a little bit of setup to make it the most powerful. You need to be able to sacrifice an artifact or an enchantment. You have Fable the Mirror Breaker, you have Reckoner Bank Buster, you have blood tokens from Blood Tithe Harvester, so you do have some amount of sacrifice fodder, and then you'll see a number of bullets that you wouldn't normally see. You see Extinction Event, Languish, and the End, in addition to cards that you would normally see in the main deck, so enable you to go find Shieldred and such. The interesting thing about this is the Go Blanks in the main. That would kind of indicate this deck is a little bit more geared towards decks like, say, Lotus Field Combo or Control, than it is necessarily for creature-based decks, but still has a good plethora of answers. And then the sideboard, you have a lot more bullets, so you see a lot more 1-0s because of Beseech the Queen enabling you to go find bullets, but still a lot of the same strategy. You're just trying to control the opponent in the early game and then close out the game fairly quickly with your mana-efficient threats. But this one having a little bit more of kind of a bring to light feel with what the rest of the deck is trying to do. Number 3 deck in the format that has showed up is kind of Boros Heroic. Now, Heroic is a deck that has certainly popped up now and again, but it has really kind of ramped to the top of the format recently. I haven't been playing enough of True Pioneer to understand why the huge jump in this deck, but it does check off a lot of the boxes. It closes out the game very quickly, making it very good against decks like Mono Green and Lotus Field combo. It has fairly good removal in the form of things like Reckless Rage and Running Volley, making it pretty decent against decks like Spirits and Greasefang combo, with really its only true weakness still being decks like Rakdos Midrange, as well as, say, decks like Blue-White Control if they're playing deck cards like Temporary Lockdown. Now, this deck doesn't give you a whole lot of time to set up. It gets on the board very quickly, especially on turn 2, turn 3, with things like Illuminator Virtuoso, 10th District Legionnaire. Has a little bit of a grindy element with decks with cards like Dreadhorde Arcanist, and if you can play well around removal, it can actually have an okay Rakdos mid matchup. So it does match up fairly well against the top decks of the format. Now, That said, it is an A+B deck. This is a creature-based deck that uses a lot of spells to pump its team. So you are vulnerable to a well-timed spot removal spell. You are vulnerable to drawing the wrong half of your deck sometimes. But still, very powerful, efficient deck. Gets on the board early, sees a lot of cards with things like Defiant Strike and Ancestral Anger, plus the Scry effects and connive effects of Illuminator Virtuoso and 10th District Legionnaire. This is a very powerful deck. The sideboard, kind of a myriad of anti-removal tech, anti-grindy tech, and then better removal spells for matchups where you need, things like Rending Volley and such. Showdown of the Skulls or Wedding Invitation tend to be your your grindy matchup cards. And you get to play Giganta, so not a... Next up, deck that's maintained a fairly steady presence in the format, but has done fairly well, especially in leagues of late, and that is Izzet Phoenix. And this is a deck that did pick up one nice new addition, and that is Sleight of Hand, which gives it a plethora of one-drop cantrips to be able to bring back your Phoenixes, trigger your things in the ices, etc. So that certainly helps, especially after the loss of Expressive Iteration last year. Consider Opt, Sleight of Hand, all very powerful in terms of card selection. A couple copies of Spell Pierce to interact, but where this deck really shines is its ability to interact with creature decks. In decks like Spirits, decks like Boros Heroic, decks like Humans, etc. You kind of get to play this mid-range game plan where you play things like Thing in the Ice, recur your Arclight Phoenixes, just kind of control your opponent in the early turns, and then set up this huge turn with either a Temporal Trespass, copied with Galvanic Iteration, take several turns, just beat your opponent down with Phoenixes, or flip a Thing in the Ice, bring a couple Phoenixes back, and beat down your opponent. Basically, the difference between the builds is whether Thing in the Ice is your main secondary threat, or whether Ledger Shredder is your main secondary threat. Now, Ledger Shredder allows you to rip through your deck, make sure Phoenix is a little bit easier to discard, good for pressuring your opponent, again, especially in matchups like Mono Green or Lotus Field Combo. The downside of makes your creature matchups a little bit worse. While Ledger Shredder is okay in those matchups, Thing in the Ice really shines against decks like Humans, Boros Heroic, etc. Rest of the deck, Pieces of the Puzzle, Treasure Cruise, all very powerful cards, filling up your graveyard, taking advantage of your graveyard, and then just kind of doing broken things from there. Your sideboard is a mixture of anti-graveyard hate, additional threats, as well as protection or counter spells, basically, and sometimes sweepers. So you'll see things like Ether Gust for Mono Green, you'll see Disdainful Stroke and Negate, fighting against, Storm the Festivals and Lotus Field combo. You'll see, the additional copy of Thing in the Ice and Temporal Trespass. Temporal Trespass gives you a little bit more of a combo feel. And then you'll see additional threats, things like Crackling Drake, Third Path, Iconoclast, Saheeli, all to make tokens or big flying threats where it doesn't matter if your opponent has things like Rest in Peace or Leyline in the Void in play. And then this sideboard and deck, you'll see a lot of the similar things. The difference being there's 4 Thing in the Ice in the main deck of this one as opposed to Ledger Shredder. And then you'll see things like Brazen Borrowers, kind of anti-hate cards, while also being an additional threat in the mid-game. These decks really comes down to, it's good against aggressive decks, has an okay grindy plan against the mid-range and control decks, but really struggles against hate cards like Rest in Peace and Leyline in the Void. Hence, you kind of see the switch plan of things like Saheeli and Crackling Drake. The other thing to look at with this deck is a little bit weak to spell-based combo. Now, there aren't a ton of the format. The main one obviously being Lotus Field combo, which we'll talk about in a second. But this is a deck that is reasonable into creatures in mid-range, kind of struggles against control and combo. Particularly the card Farewell can undo a lot of what you have going on. So there are some weaknesses, hence you'll see things like Spell Pierce, Disdainful Stroke, Mystical Dispute, etc. This is certainly a deck that would benefit greatly if Lotus Field did not exist. Otherwise, it's a fairly reasonable against a lot of portion of the format, although a little weak to Mono Green, especially if a Karn resolves early and torches your graveyard. Alright, the final number 5 on the party is Lotus Field combo. Now, much like decks like Blue-White Control, decks like Rakdos Sack, etc. This is a deck that is, and Izzet Phoenix, this is a deck that has churned through the top 5 in and out. Usually it's right on the cusp of the top 5. The power of this deck, it's a spell-based combo deck, so if you can't interact with that or if you can't kill it quickly enough, it's a deck that can overpower you. It has this kind of sideboard transformational plan in a lot of the builds, where it has things like Sakama and Dragonlord Dromoka to bring in, so it becomes this kind of like mid-range ramp control deck. giving it game against the creature decks in the post-board games. But its main thing is a spell-based combo. First order of business, get Lotus Field into play. Second order of business, copy it with Thespian Stage. And then from there, use things like Hidden Strings and Pour Over the Pages to make an absurd amount of mana. Use that absurd amount of mana to either cast Emergent Ultimatum, go find a Dark Petition, and then eventually find your win con. Now, historically, this deck used to play things like Mastermind's Acquisition, Fae of Wishes to be able to go wish for Approach of the Second Sun. Now, a lot of decks have gone away from that and have moved towards this kind of win con with Chandra. The way the Chandra win works is basically you play Chandra, you take it down, kill your opponent. You play a Balaged Recovery, get back the Chandra. You have a second copy of Balaged Recovery ready to go. You copy it, cast it, copy it with Chandra's ability, pick up Chandra and the other Balaged Recovery in the graveyard. And then when you have Omniscience in play, this is kind of a loop where you get to Chandra, take down, kill your opponent, or deal 5 to your opponent. Use Balaged Recovery to pick up it and the other copy of Balaged Recovery, and kind of get this loop where you just dome your opponent to death 5 damage at a time, while also being able to kill other things on their board. That's the primary loop kill. The other way you can kill is some of these variants run a copy of Lair of the Hydra. You get a bunch of mana, tap your opponent's stuff down with copies of Hidden Strings, and then just beat your opponent to death with a very large Lair of the Hydra. Those are the two primary win cons in the main, and then obviously you have alternative win cons in the sideboard. Some of the newer additions to the deck is some number of Voraging Satyr, help to speed the deck up, especially against matchups like Mono Green. And then obviously the changes in the win con that we've kind of talked about. The rest of the slots, Emergent Ultimatum, Pour Over the Pages, etc. have all kind of become staples across a lot of these decks. Look at a slightly different version. Now, obviously this one still has a lot of the same things going on. You still have the Chandra kill in the main. Joint Exploration is an interesting little card. Some of the dig cards are, your tutors or your card advantage spells, things like Dig Through Time, Behold the Beyond, Dark Petition. Those vary depending on the preferences of the pilot, but a lot of times you have the same key cards, and then it just comes down to how do you have cards in your piles for Emergent Ultimatum to be able to get to the point where you're casting Omniscience, you're getting your Chandra, and then you're doming your opponent to death, or you're beating down with a Lair of the Hydra. A lot of these sideboard game plans revolve around boarding out a good bit of your combo, boarding in things like Dromoka and Sakama, as well as sweepers, to be able to, with temporary lockdown, expel the interlopers. Copies of Doomscar, copies of Sun's Fury? Can't remember the name of it. Basically, you're bringing in some number of cheap sweepers, more expensive sweepers. You're bringing in these overwhelming, powerful creatures, and you're just turning into this kind of like mid-range creature control deck. It's kind of your way of fighting the creature-based decks. So deck is very powerful. It has some good matchups. Rakdos Midrange has a bit of a struggle against it. Izzet Phoenix is particularly bad against it. It can overpower decks like Blue-White Control, especially in the post-board games. Tends to struggle against decks like Humans and Spirits, but does have sideboard plans for those things. Its main number one weakness, Mono Green Devotion with Karn. The Stone Brain can hurt it a lot. Cards like God Pharaoh's Statue, Damping Sphere all can hurt. So, that's why you see a lot of copies of Beseju, a lot of copies of Otawaru. Sometimes you used to see copies of things like not Nature's Claim, but basically an entire artifact stuff. Now the deck just goes, I'll figure a way around it and kill you some other way. But this is the really the only pure combo deck in the format that doesn't involve creatures, decks like Greasefang and such. So those are the top 5 decks in the Pioneer format. Now, other decks that are relevant, decks like Greasefang, Spirits, Humans, Fires of Invention, all those kind of decks. As far as where we're going to be going with coverage this month on the channel, this month we've already done quite an extensive playlist on Mono Green. If you want to check that out. Of late, we've also done some work with Azorius Field Lotus Control. We have a small playlist on that if you want to check that out. But this month on this channel primarily, we're going to be focusing on Rakdos Midrange, kind of filling out our, getting a little bit more up to date on some of these newer versions of the deck, like the Beseech the Queen version, etc. Kind of start building a sideboard guide for it, a mulligan guide, etc. for beginners and intermediates. That way we can pass you off to something like Misplaced Ginger, who is probably primarily the biggest content creator, at least for the deck, and expert of the deck overall. But this channel is mainly designed to be your bridge between coming to know the format and getting to those experts and understanding how they're playing, with kind of a little bit of general knowledge for the format as well. So if you like that kind of content, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you for our next video.